Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for faith and community partners. In today's program, we'll be shining a light on the realities of COVID-19 post-recovery worship and community life. A special thanks. The San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing is supported by a grant from the Center at Sierra Health Foundation. Thank you. The important and ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the host and answered, time permitting. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. My name is Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for community and faith partners. COVID-19 traumatically impacted every aspect of human life and interaction around the globe. Response to the pandemic dramatically altered every aspect of social engagement, which, for the better part of 3 years, necessitated a transition to isolation and virtual existence. Like the new normal for all sectors of society, the nature of worship and community life were not exempt from this metamorphosis and forever changed. As we cautiously find ourselves in this post-recovery state, religious and lay leaders are taking stock of these changes in order to chart a course for the future. This week's online briefing for community and faith partners, hosted by the San Francisco Interfaith Council, welcomes 3 religious leaders who will share the pandemic experiences of their respective houses of worship, how they pivoted to new and creative ways of ministering, what phenomena in human behavior toward worship and community life they are witnessing as we emerge from isolation, and how they are planning for the future. Before we begin, we will read this interfaith statement that is shared before each one of our gatherings. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other, that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Reverend Marvin K. White, who is the Minister of Celebration at Glide Memorial Church. Reverend White is a dear friend personally, but also came to Glide and navigated them through the pandemic, as well as the grief of the passing of founder and former Minister Cecil Williams and his wife Janice. It is wonderful to have you with us, Marvin. I know that you've had challenges over the years in taking that historic and iconic church through these transitions, and I was wondering if you would lead us in a reflective moment to ground us and give us a foundation for the conversation that will ensue.
Thank you for your wishes and your blessings on Glide and the ministry at Glide, and the people of the Tenderloin. I was thinking a lot about dispensation. And of course, I had to Google it because I haven't been in seminary in quite a few years. But a dispensation is a way of ordering things, an administration, a system, or a management. In theology, a dispensation is the divine administration of a period of time, and each dispensation is a divinely appointed age. Dispensationalism is a theological system that recognizes these ages ordained by God to order the affairs of the world. As a public theologian, as someone who operates in the theopoetics, as someone who makes up their own theologies all the time, it's important throughout the pandemic that we remembered that we had to ask, where is God in this every day? And where is God leading us and taking us? And what is God spreading alongside the virus into the world? And in addition to being infected, similarly, what is being transferred and transmuted similarly throughout the world? And a few things came out of it. I think we loved more. I think we cared for each other more. I think all of a sudden there were resources, a speed in which cures were available, a collective and a consciousness of thought and care, a globalization of love and an account of the amount of people who were passing away and a care for those who lost people as well. I I sit and marvel not at how few people, have returned, but that there are still people who are out in the world who are still impacted by the effects of the pandemic and will need to come back in, will need to understand what has just happened to them. And I don't think we have yet seen the return from this dispensation when folks come back into our houses of worship, into our faith-based organizations, into our theological circles and faith-based led, social justice movements. And they will come back more empathetic, with more sympathy, having a global lens of how God works in the world and through what we call crisis as well. So we are consistent in our faith and in our gathering at Glide because we know that people are coming back. And as much as love spread out in the world, we know that love will come back home to us. So that's what I woke up thinking about, how we will regather in this moment.
1,000 thanks. An important prayer and an important reflection to begin what we are going to do today, and wishing God's blessings on you, dear Marvin, in all that you do.
Thank you, Michael.
This conversation arguably could be one of the most important briefings that we have. For those of you who remember, before we even knew what Zoom was, we were contacted by the San Francisco Department of Public Health at the very beginning of this pandemic, and were asked to gather faith leaders and to provide information to them so that they could make important policy decisions on behalf of those who were entrusted to their care. We were told this needed to happen every week because this pandemic was not just merely a health pandemic, it was an equity pandemic. It had so many different dimensions. And so with the support of the city, the Department of Public Health, Emergency Management, and the mayor's office, we produced over 100 of these briefings. All along the way, we remembered that at some point we would emerge from this crisis, and it would be the role of the faith community to help navigate our faithful and our city back to connectivity. And so I am grateful to the three faith leaders who will be joining us today. They come from very different congregations, and they were very much at the heart of shepherding their flocks during the pandemic. And today they're going to talk to us about how they pivoted, what they are seeing, and how they're planning for the future. We have with us the Reverend B. Chun of St. Francis Lutheran Church, the Reverend Vanessa Rush Southern, First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, and also the board chair for the San Francisco Interfaith Council. I should mention B will be coming on our board, and the Reverend Canon Anna Rossi, the Canon Presenter and Director of Interfaith Engagement at Grace Cathedral, who is also a member of our board. Some very, very gifted and talented clergy who will enlighten us today. And I would encourage you to listen to them carefully and send your chats to Q&A so that they can respond to them. Your question might be something that other people didn't think to ask, or maybe were cautious to ask, but would be of benefit to all. Let's begin with this question. What's the new normal?
Let me jump in here. So first of all, I want to thank you, Michael, and the staff and board of the Interfaith Council. Thank you again so very much to help us navigate through COVID. Your weekly briefings were so helpful to help us stay current with the various guidelines and the protocols. That was wonderful service to all of us. So you ask, what is the new normal? My question is there such a thing as the new normal? Yes, in many ways, we are in a new world. For sure, I think this new world has already begun long before COVID, but COVID has accelerated and exacerbated many of the trends, many of the things that had already sort of like been in the pipeline before COVID. So one of the trends that I saw was this, that organizations that have assets and resources and staff and programming have been able to attract clients and worshipers and participants, and organizations that were limited in their resources and limited in what they could offer had started to decline. And eventually some of those smaller congregations, smaller faith communities, smaller organizations can't survive anymore. And during COVID and even now, many smaller churches just died. And of course, they may have died eventually, but COVID really accelerated that process. And yes, we have seen also that with businesses, it is also true. When I look around in my neighborhood, I see many small businesses have closed their doors, and it may have been that that was already in the cards for them. They may have closed eventually, but COVID certainly was speeding up all of that. And then there are faith communities, organizations that are sort of like in the middle. They have some resources, they can hang in there, they are not really thriving. And that creates a lot of stress. Now, if you know that you cannot make it, then you just have to make your peace with it. And you have to close your doors and move on. And it's hard and there's grief, but there's also some clarity or even some relief. But when you're in the middle, it's sort of tough and also really exhausting. So I want to briefly mention my own faith community, St. Francis Lutheran Church. Before COVID, we had one single worship service. We worship in an old Victorian building. There's no sound system. And before worship, there was no tech enhancement at all for worship. So overnight, we were in lockdown. We shifted to Zoom services. And for many of us, including myself, this was the very first time we've ever even used Zoom, a new technology. So we had to do very quick learning. And as it happens, learning still continues if I may speak a little bit out of order. Before we got together for today's presentation, we just learned from Anna one new Zoom presentation trick, and Trey said, no, he had never seen that one before. So we are still learning technology. But then we came back into worship service and we realized, now what? Some people still are not there where they feel safe. Some people may not ever want to worship in person. So we have to think about a hybrid service and broadcasting, streamlining, which is yet another technology for us to learn, another infrastructure to build. And the first broadcasting system, we sort of like build it on a shoestring. And then we realized, well, no, this is here to stay, and we really need to do a good job. And so we had to do a lot of fundraising to get the necessary equipment, and we're still every day working to figure out how to do good broadcasting and so forth. And so for every little church to do that on their own is really, really exhausting. And so I'm thinking perhaps we need a new model. Somehow, going forward together. Because sometimes there are things we can do better when we work together. The Interfaith Winter Shelter is a great example of what can be accomplished when we work together. And so I think there is a lot of potential for us working together. I feel like I've been a little bit negative about this COVID thing and didn't really address yet many of the good gifts and benefits. For example, I think we have really also built creativity, we've built resilience and resourcefulness. And so I think we have a lot of gifts that we can share with each other, and the learning that we can teach each other, new tricks, and help each other to find a way forward. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I want to briefly say one more thing about Zoom. So yes, we have been learning the technology and still learning technology and mastering technology. But Zoom is not just technology, it's also connecting people with people. And the human element is really hard to capture with Zoom. I'm not saying it cannot be done, but I think we have yet to discover how to do it well. Because there's something missing when we cannot meet face to face. I still remember the beautiful interfaith breakfast that we had at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where we ate together, we sat around a table, we could chat before and after. And how to create such a connection by Zoom is, I think, a task for us to figure out. So this going forward with people not only mastering new technologies, but also maybe learning how to support our common humanity is something that I think we can explore more. So I want to stop here, and I think other people are taking turns and sharing their experiences.
Thank you so much, Bea. I think at this point, I want to just share a little bit of the context for Grace Cathedral, which is one of those better resourced congregations and nonetheless had its own difficulties to navigate. So we began testing live streaming and developing a roadmap for its implementation in 2018. The final cables for that live streaming technology were laid as it would happen in January of 2020. And so we had the gift of that in place. Throughout the pandemic, we were generally pretty rigorous in our adherence to COVID protocol under the guidance of our bishop and obviously the Interfaith Council in its work with local authorities. This is true for many, but it is true in a particular way for us that sanctuary is central to our identity. So the building matters. And that's true for worshipers, and it's also true for pilgrims and tourists and people who access it as a cultural institution. We have a really strong in-person work culture, and that has often, though not always, been translated to the board and committee and volunteers. And of note, we began the pandemic with a large pastoral staff. We had a dean and 6 full-time clergy. Today, we have a dean and 3 full-time clergy. So that is pretty impactful in terms of the changes that we've made. I want to talk in 3 basic areas. One is about daily prayer, one about funerals, and then this question of metrics. When we look to daily prayer, that is a really important part of the life of a cathedral, and it's not what most people see. And so I'm going to focus on that. In the old days, in the before times, we had morning and evening prayer on a daily basis. Weekdays, that meant 8 to 10 people in a side chapel, and it was largely staff, both clergy and laity. And so it had a particular role in the formation of a staff culture and staff practice. And it's what triggered the opening of the building. Evening prayer would be slightly smaller, maybe 5 people in a side chapel, and it was often the way we closed a day. We knew we were done because we had gone to evening prayer. We had what we called, we had midday Eucharist, 12:10 Mass. It was daily, it was in a side chapel. There were maybe 5 people there, but it was led by a team of either diocesan chaplains or staff clergy. And that convening point and shared experience was really important. The custom for that was pretty spare, but the chaplains often hung out in the cathedral afterwards so that they were available for greeting and for counsel. We no longer have that. What we have today instead looks like this. Morning prayer has migrated online, and its 8 people are now 15 to 25. They're gathered from, basically over the West Coast, so it's not place-based. But it's a really important pastoral touch point for us and an easy port of entry for people who are exploring a deeper life of faith in the congregation. We only meet for evening prayer once, but it's a hybrid service that is adjacent to a yoga practice. And so we hope in the fullness of time that that might grow a little bit. Our midday Eucharist is now a weekly event, and that means that we have many more people. Once a month, we have a senior community that gathers there. And instead of forming a staff culture or a culture of people in the diocese, what it does is form volunteers. There's significant laity that gather midweek, and it's a time of meeting and lunches, fellowship, and it has become very important to us. I'm going to talk a bit about funerals. In COVID, that we learned how to grieve. We didn't learn how to grieve. It was really problematic for so many reasons, not least of which was those people who could not bury folks. But it makes me remember that even before the onset of COVID, there was something deeply countercultural about holding a full funeral. So I started to think about the last time I saw a casket was 2019. Even in those times, people maybe felt like they wanted to have a celebration of life or some less formal closure. And so the culture around death even then was tenuous. Post-COVID, I feel like people sometimes envision funerals a bit like weddings. They want to delay it 6 months so that they can convene the right people. There's a guest list and a different kind of a sense of ceremony. I've had conversations with people who envision them to be a bit like private concerts or a party have some incidental ritual or Christian elements, but that's not the focus of it. So it really brings up for me both the question of how do we acknowledge death in its finality and as a necessary precursor to any other vision for what might come after death. And then how do we hold embodiment in a tradition that is where the body is so central? And so those questions really remain for me. who counts? So the church is required to keep statistics, and this is important for internal reporting. It is important to the Ryan Bergs of the world that write graphs about religion. It's important to Pew Research, etc. And when we're dealing with a live stream hybrid world, it is impossible to know who you're actually talking to. So routinely, I have this experience of being in the pulpit and looking out and seeing some cast of people and noting that there's somebody that I didn't see. And that person then writes me and says, oh, I really was interested in X and such in your sermon. I was listening from my family's house in, North Carolina. So you don't know who you're talking to. When people are in the room, you have some sense of their attention. When they are engaged on live stream, you don't know if they're making scones, and listening to the Grace instead of listening to NPR. You just don't know. Live stream also is a portal for what I would call multiple religious belonging, multiple community belonging. So we might gather friends. For example, my devoutly Roman Catholic parents in Ohio listen to the Grace live stream from time to time, mostly to hear their daughter preach. Their regularity does not make them resident members of the congregation or part of its planning for the future. So our metrics right now suggest roughly a 1-to-3 ratio. That is at a principal liturgy, which for us is twice a week. That for every person in the pews, there are 3 people who will listen online to the service or to the homily within the week. How should that data be interpreted, recorded, or reported? And those are my questions of the moment.
I have to tell you on that last point, our interfaith work has just expanded. We have a board member, Wilma Batiste, who she at a board meeting said that she listens and goes online and takes in the services all over the world of different faith traditions. And so an interesting ancillary impact that the pandemic had. I'm wondering, Vanessa, are there changes that are still unclear or emerging?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the concrete pieces and that Bea and Anna named are really important, and we probably can tease out some more in the Q&A with folks who've been listening if you want to chime in with questions. But I think there's some other things that we're feeling our way through that are maybe they're palpable, but in a different way. And so I thought it maybe just to mention a few of them. I'm aware how much when you talk to other clergy, I just talked to a colleague the other day who's training in spiritual direction, but with a trauma-informed lens. And I think that idea of a trauma-informed lens to leadership, and particularly religious leadership, spiritual leadership, has come up for us. And I don't remember, except in very specific settings, people talking about it the same way. And so recognizing that we right now are living in a post-traumatic moment that we can only sort of unpack slowly as it reveals itself and as we sort of hone our skills of perceiving and responding to it in light of that. So just to unpack really quickly and remind us all of what we actually already know is not only was there the shutdown of our entire life as we knew it, and First UU Society, Unitarian Universal Society, like Grace, actually had live stream in place for a few months. So that part for us was really helpful for our people in giving them, because a lot of the trauma-informed lens is about how do you give people a sense of safety and control when safety and control has been taken from them. And so we were able to give people, just by luck, that in the sense that they could attend worship online in a place, see things that looked familiar. It was very different for us leading worship to an empty house, but to them, it felt deeply comforting. And people named that when they came back from pandemic and during pandemic, what an anchor it was for them to be able to sort of be in their church, even virtually. But I think recognizing that everything was taken from people in a significant way, and with, very little notice, which is incredibly traumatic, maybe the most traumatic thing we can experience. But as we all remember, a lot of other trauma unfolded, right? There was the racial reckoning, which was long overdue, but still, painful to sort of go through, and to go through like together, right? All of these things we went through together, but we went through together without being in embodied community. And as we all know, there are lots of responses to fear, right? Fear, you can, flight, fight, but also, befriend, right? That desire, the comfort that we get that quiets us in moments of panic by just being held or in the presence of another person, that was denied to many of us. And certainly the collective sense of power to be in relationship to the collective sense of uncertainty and tumult that was, about facing some of the trauma of our nation's history and the present experience of that and the pain of that. We had Washington with the threat of our democracy, unfolding before us. Those of us in the Bay Area remember those apocalyptic days of fire, which were like atavistically frightening, and all of it unfolding, at this one period of time. So I think we come out of it having all been through this and more. If we lost people, we weren't able to be with them. That's another huge trauma. And we step back into life that looks fairly normal, but we haven't processed this. And so I think just starting to be aware of and enter with curiosity about like, where are we seeing some of that show up and where can we be more sensitive to it? So the three of us talked before we met. And one of the things that I appreciated that Bea mentioned was just the grief that's part of trauma, and paying attention to where we see grief and all the layers of grief, loss of certainty, loss of things the way they used to be for us. Even maybe people mourn the loss of, the services at Grace the way they used to be, even though there's new life to a different way of being together. That's also exciting, that you can mourn the thing you've lost, even as you celebrate the gain that you have out of this transition. I think there's, this also loss, about just the familiar and comfortable, but overall the sense of general safety. I mean, already we're hearing about another virus that's mutating and the fear of it. And so that the sense that we had false of our safety has been taken away, and we are continue to live with the grief of that and the fear of that. And so how to hold that in community, I think, is one of the challenges, how to hold people and hold one another through that, but particularly in the face of the fact that we're still just entering back into the habits of being in community. So I think, the question about how we get people back into embodied connection, because embodied connection does something for us that is healing and reassuring, and a counterpoint. To see good people in person as a counterpoint to all the news that talks about how horrific human beings can be to one another, and the sort of online trolling and all of that. But the healing that comes being back together is a challenge for us. And I don't know what you all are seeing in the places that you are, but I've had people come to me and say they watched every live stream during pandemic, and that they were a longtime member, and that they only came back a year ago into community, that it was so hard for them. Or run into a lay leader when I was dropping something off at our house who said, I just don't know how to get back to church. And I said, I don't understand. What do you mean you don't know how to get back to church? Not someone who's immunocompromised, not someone who lives with someone who's at risk, where there's different fears and important considerations. And I didn't know what to say. So I finally just said, well, you know how to come back to church, don't you? You just come back to church. But it's literally the barrier to stepping back into the building. And it's so strange to me that for so many of us, where the habit was coming into community, that actually there's this difficulty getting back into the muscle of being back in community. And I don't entirely understand that trauma, but I'm aware that it's still with us, and that it's impeding some of the healing that we also need as well as just collective power that we need to do the things we need to be doing in the world, and standing up for, creating the beloved community that we need to create, and all of that involves unleashing our collective power and feeling it, and feeling empowered by it. So I think that's some of it. We're seeing rising loneliness, which was already the case before pandemic, and is even more so exacerbated. So I think those are some of the things that I'm, Michael, that I'm aware of that feel like we're still feeling our way through. And what are they, and how do we attend to them?
Thank you for giving a voice to that, because these are certain things that I think that so many of us have been witnessing, experiencing, but I think when you hear it out loud, it's important. To the three of you, what is the role of our communities and organizations in helping people navigate this as the emerging new normal takes shape, so we can shape that new normal for the better? Don't all talk at once.
Well, I just say that I think one of the tools, the grief shows up often as anger, right? Because anger is a powerful form of grief. So just recognizing that the reactivity that we might be seeing in some of our members is just the grace to extend to one another that it's probably about this. And so to enter with a curiosity and a pastoral presence and ask people how they're doing. And we've actually given people some tools that were out of our youth movement that have been, they sound silly, but they're really useful to have everybody have at their fingertips. And two of them are just words that you can say that name a dynamic. So one is ouch. So when something happens in a meeting that feels unnecessarily sort of hurtful, as we actually learn how to be human and in community and together in the spite of all the feelings we have, that the room quiets. And the meeting takes a step back, and we ask what just happened. And another one is just for someone to be able to say, whoa, which is another way to be like, there's a dynamic in the room right now, or an energy that maybe I'm curious about that feels like it might be getting in our way. And so just these steps to be able to, when people get triggered, to have people say a word where everyone knows what to do. We all take a step back, we all take a deep breath. We either invite someone to say what hurt their feelings, or we invite someone to say what they're picking up in the room that we might want to name, or we say, like, I feel like we're not listening to each other, or I feel like there's some frustration in the room and I'm not sure what it's about, but I'd love for us to navigate it with a little more gentleness. And they've been really powerful tools for us to be able to be together again and not, and arrest some of the triggered patterns that might be showing up. So that's just one example I can think of.
I sort of wish my colleague, the Reverend Mary Carter Green, were with me, because she oversees our pastoral care at the cathedral. And what you're saying, Vanessa, really makes me think of some of the movement in our community to engage lay leaders in pastoral care. And so there's been an ongoing training program for the last 6 or so months, so that we can be better prepared to do that, because there is all of that grief present, the acting out, the unfamiliarity with social norms or the disregard for them. I think that is another part of what came out of the pandemic. But that in addition to that, the thing that I'm also aware of is that clergy are tired. That even if we have the skills to identify these patterns and to circumvent them and to use language that helps redirect, it's exhausting to do that constantly. And so there's a part of me that says it's our role to hold that container. And there are also times, a colleague used to say, when you need to just let the train jump its track. And it's not clear to me where that is, but your notion of the language, whoa, that just happened, leaves a little room for how we deal when the train jumps, and that itself is not catastrophic. What is it like in your context, B?
I just want to say to both of you, this is exactly what I was hoping for, that we start conversations about little tools that we found helpful that we can expand on, because I think going forward, definitely we could develop a more, I love your word, embodied presence, embodied culture, how to be bring this embodiment into Zoom rooms and not just talking heads. There's a whole other section that I feel like has huge potential, and I feel very far removed from it given the demographics of our congregation, and that is youth and children's ministry, and how that can be maybe expanded now in this new, not normal, I don't know how to even call it. And I'm thinking of how impactful it was for children not to go to school for for a long period of time, not to have graduations or have them in a very different way. And little children who grow up with, like, we have one council member who has a little 2-year-old, and when we have council meetings, he'll want to come on Zoom because he knows all of us and say hello to all of us, and that's kind of really sweet. And I'm thinking one could do children's story time with Zoom, because children could move around in their own space. They don't have to sit still like they would have if we have, like, a place of worship where there are maybe sort of like sometimes standards of behavior that may not always be very child friendly. And I think there's still a lot that we can maybe dream about and think about, because it's so easy to talk about what COVID has taken from us, and the stress and the grief, which are all very, very real. But there are also yet so many untapped gifts that we could still discover. So I hope that we will have many more conversations like that, where we can share, like, oh, what about this? And here's what we'll do. We just say, ouch, take a deep breath. Our method is that when somebody is triggered, we say, let's have a bio break, whether we actually need a bio break or not. But this way, everybody can, step back and maybe regroup or reground, or there's many other, have a glass of water. So perhaps, learning more tools like that is one of the ways forward.
I'd like to pick up on something that Bea said, because we have a question from the audience. Mary Magaloni Ramos says, approximately 245,000 children lost one or both parents to COVID in the United States. There's a crisis of chronic absenteeism in the schools today. I wonder if there is a collective trauma that isn't being addressed. What type of grief outreach can be offered on a large scale for children and youth? So this is building upon what Bea was talking about. Open the floor.
What comes to mind right away is every year in October, the Children's Defense Fund encourages an observation weekend called the Children's Sabbath. That is an interfaith observation. And I'm thinking maybe there could be a communal approach one time, where usually they give a theme for each year, but I don't know that we must always follow the theme. Maybe there is, something to think about. What about children's, burdens, griefs, and how can we, pray for them, acknowledge that in our spaces of worship and in our rituals.
I like that. Oh, yeah. I was also just thinking that part of the remedy for grief is not a false joy, but is joy and connection, right? And part of the remedy to the fear of losing a parent is something that actually religious community and community organizations can offer, which is the knowledge, as church always has, or synagogue or temple or mosques have offered, which is you are held by a larger family of people who are watching out for you. And so I think the hard part is that you have people who find it harder because the parents are also exhausted to sort of bring their kids to service. And yet actually what the kids need is more and more connection, right? A sense that they are held by this large community of people who are there for them in significant ways, as they have been, right? There are stories in our church of people whose parents were struggling and, other people swept in and were the honorary aunties who picked them up and drove them to church and took them to the symphony and, showed up at important family events. And it's like grief has a lot of solutions, it strikes me. And one of them is still this challenge of like, it's not efficient to come to church and be together, right? It's more efficient to join on Zoom, but Zoom it gives us lots of extra opportunities. But what I'm struck by is how it gives us a false sense of what used to happen. Like we might get the work of a committee done, but we're not talking to someone when we're going to get a cup of coffee or after the meeting or driving them home and finding out that their spouse has Parkinson's and they are alone in it, right? And that what they came to church for was not to run the membership committee, right? It was the membership committee fed the church and the church held people when their spouse had Parkinson's. So it's like, how do we get that back? Because that's the meat of what we offered people, I think.
Can we hold a place card there? Because we have a question that dovetails on that. But Anna, would you like to get your 2 cents in about the
let's take the next question, and if I want to circle back, I can do that.
Okay, fair enough. And this is from Daniel, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Borisekwizits. There's a discussion about live stream. Do any of the panelists use Zoom for hybrid interactive service? I know that one of the great frustrations, especially in the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, was their sacramental churches. And so, I mean, for a period of time, basically the sacraments were denied people because we couldn't be together and doing this. I think sometimes Zoom and live stream can be a passive experience and not interactive. I'm wondering, did any of your congregations use live stream creatively to be able to interact? Maybe if I'm reading the question right.
Why don't I pick this up and then see where that goes? So we use a combination of things. We have some services that are in person only, some that are on Zoom only, some that are hybrid in person and Zoom, and some that are hybrid in person and live stream. For me, the in person and live stream is the most ambiguous because I don't really know who I'm dealing with when I'm there. However, in our Zoom services, so for example, on Wednesday mornings, we have a Zoom-based morning prayer where one of our musicians is actually in the nave playing the principal organ. And so we chat prayer requests. I can see everybody that's there. We have some tether to the building. On special occasions or observances like Ash Wednesday, we'll lead it in a fully hybrid way. And that is technologically demanding. We don't have an AV team involved in that. It's me and my staff predominantly. We also do that at our 6 o'clock service on Sunday nights. And there's a strong contingent, maybe 15 or so people in total, and on any given week, 7 to 10 of them are there, who join and participate in that congregation via Zoom. So when we greet them, we acknowledge their presence, we take prayer requests via Zoom and integrate them into the service, and have kind of reformed the closing rite so that the blessing is specifically addressed following the farewell to the folks who are on Zoom. There's some shortfalls to that. We're not staffed in a way that would allow us to develop those practices more fully, but I think the seeds of them are there.
I'm going to ask a question, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I go to Grace Cathedral. It's my spiritual home. Okay. So I got a chance to be sort of a secret shopper when I go back to see how the information we were giving out was being implemented. Okay. And the one thing that I found with most of the congregations, and I went to First UU to preach and saw all the precautions, and I felt like our houses of worship had taken steps above and beyond to protect their own. And I was so proud of that, because when the mayor asked me to come to one of her press conferences and was concerned about what was going to happen that first year around Easter and Passover, I used it as an opportunity to congratulate the houses of worship for their leadership. I remember stepping down from that pulpit, though, and realizing that it's a tale of two cities, the haves and the have-nots. And there were equity issues that Vanessa raised as well. I would like to circle back and allow you to address that, but I'd also like to ask you about the new role of the greeter, okay, at the congregation, because all of a sudden, as people were starting to come back, the greeters were monitoring and welcoming, but monitoring at the same time. And I'm wondering if, as we move into the future, that there can be an enhanced role for the greeter moving forward. And let me tell you what's in the back of my mind on this. Prior to the pandemic, there were a series of worldwide terrorist attacks on houses of worship. And the first people you meet at the door are greeters, and they're the ones who are usually kind of keeping an eye and making sure everybody is feeling welcome. Do you feel like the greeter also could play a unique role because of what the new roles they had to play during the pandemic in active shooter and just being an extra set of eyes for the safety and security of congregations moving forward? There were a lot of things in there, so you take whatever you want, okay?
Yeah, what struck me about what you said in the first part of what you were sharing, Michael, was that I think we have gotten better as congregations at being sensitive to the needs of folks who are immunocompromised or otherwise sort of. So, we have members now who wear N95s because they are under chemo and radiation, and they wouldn't have come before, but now they can come because we're all comfortable with them wearing an N95 mask, and we don't make them feel awkward about that. So I do think that's one of the other benefits, is we're all much more aware of the levels of people's needs to be protected health-wise and how we can make accommodations for them being with us. And maybe our greeters, to your question about the greeters, our greeters are also sensitive and actually know where their N95 masks stashed close by in the welcome and greeter desk, because we also now have those regularly stashed away because we're aware that we're in constant need to offer people protection if they want it. But also, a lot of us had like red, yellow, or green, or whatever our symbols were for people's need for total comfort when they were coming back, or need for a little bit of, sort of distance, or really needing to know they're not going to be touched or hugged or spoken too closely to because they were actually struggling with socially or physically. I think we've also gotten sensitive to the fact that like people have different social boundaries, and that some people, as part of allowing people different boundaries because of health issues, that like we have people who now, for whatever reason, lots of reasons, neurodivergence, say, I want a red circle, and people know that means, like, don't just come up and assume I want to be touched by you or have you invade my space or whatever. So I think there's a lot of sensitivity, and our ushers have, are trained in that sensitivity. Yeah, but you raised another more serious, ominous issue too about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anna?
One of the gifts of the pandemic is that in the before times, we had this somewhat arbitrary distinction between ushers and greeters that didn't necessarily help them cross-train or deliver things together. It helped form particular identities and distinct tracks. And when we decided to come back, there were some things that, like some distinctions I just did away with. We needed a team of people that were committed to a time of transition, and they may not be the people who would be doing that work in ordinary time. And so I'm really grateful for the leadership of our head usher, Bill Quinn, as well as the number two, who's a longtime member of the congregation, but also an ex-Marine. And the two of them don't miss a beat together. And so having them in positions of leadership and forming all of the hospitality ministry has been exceedingly helpful in ordinary times, but also when there's an incident, and we all have incidents. That's part of being a public place. They work closely with our security, and we have to be honest and say we are not SFO. We don't have the TSA working for us. It's not our expertise. It's not within our resources. And even if it were within our expertise and resources, I don't know that that would deliver on the core mission. So that there are, in the same way that we make ourselves vulnerable for the sake of love at a personal level, I think we do that at an institutional level, because that's what our mission, I think, demands. They're just things we can't prevent without eroding that first principle of who we are.
We do have another question here. Since COVID and other viruses are still running rampant and very prevalent, why are people not masking up? I do not attend groups and crowds, and it disturbs me to see volunteers and employees not using gloves and masks serving in senior congregate meal programs. I continue to wear a mask, especially on buses and just on outings, period. I have settled to enjoy Sunday services on Zoom. Why are people using post-traumatic when these viruses are still prevalent? The pandemic isn't over. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I'm going to jump in here, and I say, so that is, I think, one of the greatest stressors, because when we went into lockdown, there was an outside guidance. There was the city ordinances. There were like outside, rules that said this is what you can and cannot do. And once the lockdown was lifted, then often it was told each organization should now establish their own rules. And we all know that where 2 or 3 people are together, there are 4 opinions. And so, and there is, to find a good way to honor everybody's need for safety, which is just really a spectrum, so that everybody's need is honored, but people also feel like, science-based, we look at the infection rate. We are not in 2020. We are clearly not in 2020 right now. So where are we? The infection rate is super low. The hospitalization rate is very low. Should we still behave as if we are in 2020? So how can we really honor people on all parts of the spectrum and be a community in the midst? I'm not really giving you an answer here. I'm realizing that, but I am just saying that this question I was just raised is a very important question, and many people have it, so it does need to be addressed. What is the best way to address it is something that maybe is one of the tasks we have as communities, faith communities, organizations, maybe we even have to build it into our infrastructure to accommodate, just like we accommodate different bathrooms or we accommodate different, needs for safety, different people. Everybody deserves to feel safe, I think. How can it be practically accomplished and how? I think that is one of the works before us. Can I also just shift one more little thing? Because one of the things that inspires me and that I'm kind of holding on as we are moving forward are those old TV shows, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Because when Vanessa says embodiment, that's what it gave me. I was a participant, even though I only watched passively. And this show was so well thought done because it had all the parts that we need to have community. It has an entrance, it has people being adjusted to the space. He took off his jacket, put on the sweater, and did all these other things. And also brought us together as a community, even though we were not a community. So there are all things that can be learned and that can be practiced. And I feel like, what else might we still learn and discover?
If I may indulge you three, and I'm going to violate my own rules. If we could, this conversation is so rich, okay? And I have three more questions. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay.
Sure.
One of them is sort of the elephant in the room question. I'm watching very carefully because, as you know, we work really closely with the CEOs of the faith-based social service agencies that have contracts with the city, and the city is going through a difficult financial time. At the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was throwing money at everybody because they wanted to make sure that the economy was supported. Financial times have changed, and I'm wondering how the pandemic's economic impact has impacted your ability to minister to your congregations and giving and the like. I know in the beginning that people were very generous and they started getting used to giving online. But if you could give us maybe some sort of insight into that dimension of congregation life, I think it might be instructive, not only to those online, but to those who will see this afterward.
I think for me, the number that I will stick to is we had 6 staff clergy plus the dean, and we now have 3, and that's dollars and cents. So I believe that we will continue to give, that we will continue to imagine different ways of funding both the life of the congregation and the cultural institution that is the cathedral. And I think a future that is designed more with the equipping of and management of skilled volunteers in what used to be staff functions is inevitable. And so formation is critical to that. I actually think spiritual formation is the direct line to fiscal I won't say solvency, but resiliency.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I think we were lucky to have staff that qualified us for PPP loans, so that was fantastic and really helpful. I don't know what we would have done without that. We are actually remarkably okay right now. We have a big renter. Our rentals of the center is back up to what it used to be, which is amazing. That means communities are meeting, and we're trying to facilitate as much of that as possible because we realize there are fewer and fewer places for people to meet, and we need that connection happening in our communities. So that's fun to see. We do have a school that rents from us, and I know their enrollment is down. So, we'll see how that goes, and that's a significant part of our income. I'm aware we're leaning a little hard on our big givers right now. And that's a dangerous thing. So I think our stewardship committee talked about the fact that we actually need to sort of get the rest of our givers up, and we need to grow. I think we're back to the pre-pandemic thing that we were beginning to focus on, which is how do you, in a significantly secular city, which I think is the harbinger of where the country is going, how do you minister to people? We get a lot of visitors, a lot of them are young adults. And how do you create a congregation that speaks to where they are and translates to where they are? So that's, if we don't figure that out, we will be in trouble. But right now we're okay. Touch wood. We have some things that I'm a little nervous about, but at the moment we are okay.
B, you're a different size community. I'm curious just to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I feel like we are a little bit of an outlier because we are actually a very small church, but unlike other small churches, we do have a few assets. I think our struggle is more the human resources, and that fewer and fewer people now taking on more and more work in how to prevent burnout. Like what you just said, what happens with greeters and ushers who suddenly need to, take on many more additional roles and responsibilities that are not roles and responsibilities that are easily to, just like one more thing on your checklist, but they can be quite impactful. And so, how do we care for each other, and what Anna said about, helping volunteers to I guess embrace a kind of leadership that is beyond just performing tasks, but it's also a combination of being like a pastoral presence to each other, because that's what we and actually in Christian faith communities, we believe that when a person is baptized, we are all ministering to each other. So but that ministry is not something we automatically know. We have skills to learn and to support each other. And I don't know, Anna, what you said, you had a pastoral care team training. So I think maybe the whole congregation needs sometimes such training. I'm sorry, Michael, I diverged for you.
No. I was thinking to myself, my first parish, the priest had to raise $100,000 a month, and this was back in the 1990s. And I asked him, I said, "Don't you feel a little guilty going back to the donors and asking?" He goes, "I'm not asking for myself.
Yes.
I'm asking for the church. And if we are ministering to the people, they'll respond." And so I think that the two are very closely tied together. There's another, I touched on the issue of equity, and I know it's a difficult issue for us to address. I'm going to give a flip side to it, though. Okay. Someone said to me early on in the pandemic that when we went on Zoom, that the playing field was leveled, because there were shut-ins who couldn't come to worship prior to. And now for the first time, everybody in the congregation had to experience worship and community life the same way. How do you respond to that? I'm just curious. I thought it was an interesting observation.
I think of one person in particular who has not lived in the Bay Area for a long time, has extenuating health circumstances, and is at morning prayer 4 times a week. And how that has made community possible, a communal life of prayer possible for them. I think also of the challenges that some of my colleagues who minister in a predominantly Latino community encountered, because the vast majority of their congregations did not have devices that made Zoom a particularly good thing. And, there was some contribution from wealthier communities of devices, but charity doesn't fix structural issues. we need to address the underlying lack of equity. So there's some both and.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Oof. Yeah, it levels the playing field in that way. It also, though, does this other thing which makes ministry harder, I think, has already made ministry harder and now makes it harder. It like levels the playing field nationally and internationally, and maybe could in some ways strengthen the local church, because people can participate who weren't participating or who were connected and are distant, or we have, you know, members who are homebound who are brilliant, lovely, and have been excluded and now aren't. But also, if we're not doing great worship, will people in a world of like seeking the best of everything
Shop.
find that their virtual church is in Dallas, Texas, right? Just the way they used to all maybe watch Oprah instead of coming to church. So it's like, there is this like, you know, there is this escalation to sort of performative best that people on the one hand should be able to access if they want it, but also I don't know, it weakens. Like, church isn't about the performative best. It's about being in conversation with a local community over time about things that are relevant to that community, with stories told about members of that community that binds you together. And I don't know, I just worry about that leveling of the playing field, I guess.
B, did you want to add anything?
No.
Well, to the last question, and I'm gonna pick up on something Anna said. When the pandemic first started, I got a call from Mary Carter Green, who was one of the staff over at Grace Cathedral, and the call was simply, "How are you doing?" And we were in such a new state and trying to provide everybody else with the information that they needed and the support they needed and the love they needed to soldier on. Nobody had ever asked me that question before. And I started tearing. I honestly started tearing. It was probably one of the most profound moments of the pandemic I can remember. And every time I see her, she goes, "I know what you're going to say." And I guess my question to you all is, how are you doing? And how has this pandemic changed you?
God, I wish you'd given that that in advance.
Silence is great, isn't it?
I mean, I had sabbatical for 3 months this year, and so did my spouse. He had 2, and we just got in. We were going to take a big trip, and we decided that we weren't going to go to Australia. We were just going to get in the car and see national parks and people we loved. So, like, bathe ourselves in beauty and people that we hadn't been able to sort of wrap our arms around for years. And that was deeply, deeply healing. So I would say, I want to echo what Anna said about just the exhaustion of clergy, but I feel a little bit better. And I think part of what I realized is, like, I need a post-pandemic vision. And, you know, I've been in problem solving, like whack-a-mole on an existential level. And I woke up and I talked to my colleague this weekend in ministry, and I'm lucky to have a colleague in ministry. I know we don't all have one, right? And I said, I need to help me remember what church is supposed to do, because I've just been in, like, how do we hold it together? Like, tell me what it means to get up on the balcony and dream again. Like, can we just have a little bit of conversation about that? And I said, I know this feels ridiculous. I can't believe I'm asking you to have this conversation, but, like, help me remember. And it was super helpful to have that conversation, but also super telling that I needed to ask my colleague to go there with me.
I'm tired too. I don't know that it's all pandemic. I don't think that's true. But I haven't stopped having ideas. Like, I don't get enough time off. And I don't mean vacation. I just mean the regularity of days without major events or crises attached to them. But any little stretch of time, and I'm like, oh wait, that poem, that liturgy, that it's and I really attribute that to a discipline of some micro breaks. But it really is a discipline, and so one day at a time.
B.
Oh, how has the pandemic changed me? Oh, I don't even know where to start. I think so many changes. Yeah, you say no, you're going to ask this question. I feel like I'm sort of like on a roller coaster, and it's in a way it's refreshing because I am not a person who likes routine and sameness. That's probably why I'm also in ministry, and I like adventure, and I like having to think of new things and finding solutions, but having to do it all the time can get tiring. I feel what I said in the very beginning, that the whole church, not just church, but maybe even faith life, maybe would be interesting to really also hear from other, places of faith or faith communities that are not Christian, how it's like for them. I feel like there has already been a huge transition long before COVID, the world getting more secular, people getting more urban, more isolated, echo chambering, and COVID has done that more, and to discover, so what does it mean to live and work and thrive and be a wife, a mother, a grandmother in all of these circumstances, not just a pastor. So I feel like it has changed me, not just in my ministry, but in my whole life too. And also, how can we support, what others are going through? I'm again going back to parents, parenting, how if we are as pastors exhausted, I cannot even imagine, parents being exhausted, the first responders being teachers, school teachers. And then finding our way back into community, finding our way, maybe a way forward into being in community in a new way. How am I doing on any given day? Sometimes I'm excited about new possibilities, and sometimes I'm just glad when I make it through another day.
I want to say to the three of you and to everybody that's out there, thank you, and be kind to yourselves. I suspect that this conversation is going to be replicated and analyzed for years to come, because the impact of this 3 years that we've gone through has changed us. And we haven't really gotten a break, because we've gone from the pandemic to an election year that is going to define who we are in the future. And especially our faith leaders are going to have to navigate our people through the next crises. And so be kind to yourselves. Physicians, heal thyself, because I think the real work is yet to come. But I want to thank you for your contributions today. This has been, it's been a conversation I've been looking forward to, and it exceeded expectations. God bless you. God keep you. This brings to a close this conversation, and stay tuned for future programming.